News radio revolves around the increasingly unstable and absurd dynamics inside WNYX as the staff finds themselves entangled in a mix of personal insecurities, ego clashes, and escalating misunderstandings that spiral into full-blown comedic dysfunction, with Dave Nelson trying and failing to maintain order as usual while the rest of the crew drifts further into their own bizarre agendas. The episode begins with a seemingly minor workplace issue that quickly snowballs when Jimmy James introduces a new idea or initiative that he believes will improve morale or productivity, but is so poorly thought out and erratically implemented that it instead throws everyone off balance. Dave attempts to mediate and keep things professional, but his authority is constantly undermined by both Jimmy's unpredictability and the staff's refusal to take anything seriously. Meanwhile, Bill McNeil becomes deeply fixated on something trivial, possibly related to his ego or status as a news anchor, and begins acting increasingly paranoid and self-absorbed, interpreting harmless comments from others as personal attacks or conspiracies against him. Lisa Miller tries to stay grounded and responsible, but ends up getting pulled into the chaos, either by trying to fix things or by becoming frustrated with the incompetence around her. Matthew Brock, as usual, misunderstands nearly everything happening around him and unintentionally adds to the confusion with his overly literal thinking and misplaced enthusiasm. Joe Gorelli brings his signature dry sarcasm and detached perspective, often pointing out the absurdity of the situation but rarely helping to resolve it, instead choosing to observe the madness like it's some kind of social experiment. Catherine Duke contributes to the escalating tension with her blunt and often aggressive personality, clashing with others and refusing to back down, even when it's clear that the situation is spiraling out of control. As the episode progresses, the central conflict becomes more exaggerated, with misunderstandings stacking on top of each other and characters doubling down on their worst instincts. Dave grows increasingly desperate to restore order, attempting multiple strategies that all fail spectacularly, whether it's trying to impose rules, appealing to logic, or negotiating with Jimmy, who remains blissfully unaware of the chaos he's causing. At some point, the situation reaches a peak where everything comes together in a chaotic confrontation or series of overlapping crises, with multiple characters arguing, accusing each other, or pursuing their own misguided goals simultaneously, creating a fast-paced and highly comedic sequence where no one is actually listening to anyone else. In classic news radio fashion, the resolution doesn't come from any real solution, but rather from the characters either exhausting themselves or abruptly losing interest in the conflict, leading to a return to the status quo that feels both inevitable and absurd. Dave is left reflecting on the futility of trying to manage such an unpredictable group, while the others move on as if nothing significant happened, highlighting the show's core theme of workplace dysfunction and the strange but enduring relationships between its characters. The humor throughout the episode relies heavily on sharp dialogue, character-driven comedy, and the contrast between Dave's attempts at normalcy and the rest of the staff's eccentric behavior, with each character contributing their own brand of chaos in a way that feels both exaggerated and oddly believable. Ultimately, the episode serves as a microcosm of the series as a whole, showcasing the delicate balance between structure and anarchy within the workplace and reinforcing the idea that despite all the dysfunction, the characters are bound together by their shared experiences and the unique environment of WNYX, making their interactions both frustrating and entertaining in equal measure, and leaving the audience with a sense that while nothing ever truly changes, that very lack of progress is what makes the show consistently funny and engaging. And as the aftermath of that chaotic peak settles into an uneasy calm, the characters each process the events in their own completely misguided ways, with Bill attempting to reassert his importance by rewriting the narrative of what just happened so that he appears as the misunderstood victim or even the hero of the situation, loudly recapping events to anyone who will listen while conveniently omitting his own irrational behavior. Lisa grows increasingly exasperated as she realizes that no one has actually learned anything from the ordeal. Her attempts to inject reason into the conversation only serving to highlight how detached everyone else is from reality. Matthew, still confused, tries to piece together what happened using fragments of conversations he only half understood, arriving at conclusions that are not only wrong, but somehow make the situation seem even more ridiculous. Joe continues to provide dry commentary, occasionally delivering cutting observations that momentarily silence the room before being completely ignored as the others resume their nonsense. Catherine remains confrontational, insisting that she was right all along regardless of the evidence, and escalating minor disagreements into full arguments purely out of stubbornness. Jimmy, meanwhile, either forgets the original issue entirely or decides that the chaos itself was somehow beneficial, possibly even declaring the whole mess a success and suggesting that similar experiments should be conducted in the future, which horrifies Dave, who is already at his limit and now has to contend with the possibility that this kind of dysfunction might become intentional rather than accidental. Dave's attempts to regain control become more frantic and borderline desperate as he cycles through different leadership tactics, from trying to enforce strict rules to attempting to appeal to the team's sense of professionalism, none of which work because the core problem is not a lack of structure but the personalities involved, each of whom operates on their own bizarre logic that cannot be easily aligned with anyone else's. The episode leans heavily into this idea, showing that the conflict is not just situational but deeply rooted in who these people are, making any real resolution impossible. At one point, Dave might attempt a heartfelt speech about teamwork or responsibility, only to have it derailed almost immediately by an off-topic comment, a misunderstanding, or a completely irrelevant argument breaking out among the staff, reinforcing the futility of his efforts as the episode moves toward its conclusion. The energy shifts from high-intensity chaos to a more subdued but equally absurd normalization, with characters casually returning to their routines as if nothing unusual occurred. Bill goes back to his broadcasting persona, likely delivering news with the same inflated sense of importance. Lisa resumes her work while quietly fuming. Matthew happily continues his duties, oblivious to how little sense everything made. Joe returns to his technical role, offering occasional sarcastic remarks that hint at his awareness of the ongoing absurdity. Catherine remains unapologetically abrasive, and Jimmy either moves onto a new idea or becomes distracted by something completely unrelated, leaving the previous disaster unresolved and unexamined. Dave, left to pick up the pieces, reflects on the situation with a mix of exhaustion and resignation, recognizing that this is simply how things are at WNYX and that his role is less about maintaining order and more about surviving the daily madness. The humor in this final stretch comes from the contrast between the scale of the chaos that just occurred and the casual indifference with which it is dismissed, creating a sense that for these characters, dysfunction is not an exception but the norm, and that any attempt to impose logic or structure is ultimately doomed. The episode closes on a note that encapsulates the show's tone, possibly with a final joke or ironic twist that underscores the lack of resolution, leaving the audience with the impression that while the characters may never change, their interactions will continue to produce endlessly entertaining scenarios, and that the real appeal of NewsRadio lies not in any overarching narrative or character development, but in the unpredictable and often nonsensical ways in which these personalities collide, making even the most mundane workplace situations feel chaotic and alive, and reinforcing the idea that sometimes the funniest stories are the ones where nothing is truly resolved and everything remains just a little bit broken. And even after that apparent return to normalcy, there is still an undercurrent of unresolved tension that lingers in subtle ways, as small callbacks to the earlier chaos keep surfacing in conversations, with characters bringing up fragments of the incident out of context, either to justify themselves or to take jabs at others. creating mini flare-ups that never quite reach the same explosive level but maintain a steady hum of dysfunction. Bill in particular refuses to let go of his version of events, occasionally interrupting others to correct the record in a way that only makes him look more ridiculous. While Lisa becomes increasingly sharp in her responses, her patience clearly worn thin as she begins to call out the absurdity more directly. Even if it doesn't actually change anything, Matthew, still trying to be helpful, starts adopting bits of language or behavior he observed during the conflict, completely misunderstanding their meaning and applying them at inappropriate times, which only confuses everyone further and unintentionally reignites old arguments. Joe continues acting as the detached observer, but there are moments where even he seems slightly more engaged than usual, as if the sheer level of chaos has managed to break through his usual indifference, though he quickly masks it with sarcasm. Catherine escalates minor disagreements into personal challenges, refusing to let anything slide and turning even the smallest comment into a confrontation, while Jimmy drifts in and out of the situation with bursts of enthusiasm, occasionally proposing follow-up ideas that are somehow even less practical than the original one, completely oblivious to the stress they cause Dave, who at this point is running on pure frustration and disbelief, trying to anticipate problems before they happen, but constantly being outpaced by the unpredictable behavior of his team. There is a sense that Dave is starting to understand that control is an illusion in this environment, and that his role is less about fixing problems and more about managing the fallout, which adds a layer of dry irony to his character as the supposed voice of reason in a place that fundamentally resists reason. The episode subtly reinforces this by showing how every attempt at structure either collapses or gets twisted into something unrecognizable by the other characters. As conversations overlap, intentions get misinterpreted, and simple tasks become unnecessarily complicated. The pacing in this section allows for smaller character moments to shine, highlighting the unique comedic rhythms of each person. From Bill's over-the-top self-importance to Matthew's innocent confusion, Joe's deadpan delivery, Lisa's grounded frustration, Catherine's aggressive confidence, Jimmy's chaotic leadership, and Dave's increasingly strained attempts to hold everything together, all of which combine to create a layered comedic environment where multiple jokes and interactions are happening simultaneously, rewarding attention to detail while still delivering immediate humor. As things wind down for the final time, there is a quiet acknowledgement, whether explicit or implied, that this cycle will repeat itself, that whatever lessons could have been learned have already been forgotten or ignored, and that the characters are effectively stuck in a loop of their own making. Yet there is also a strange sense of comfort in that predictability, as their flaws and quirks, while disruptive, are also what define their relationships and keep the dynamic alive. The closing moments likely include a final comedic beat that encapsulates this idea, perhaps with Dave attempting one last time to impose order only to be immediately undercut by something trivial, or with another character casually introducing a new problem just as things seem settled, ending the episode on a note that feels both unresolved and perfectly in line with the show's identity, leaving the audience with the understanding that in the world of news radio, chaos is not a problem to be solved, but a constant to be embraced, and that the real story lies not in any single conflict, but in the ongoing, ever-evolving interplay between these deeply flawed yet endlessly entertaining characters.